Hey, what's going on, guys? For this GUNPLA tip video, we're going to go over seam line removal, and we're going to be working on the HGUC Gustav Karl kit here, which has a number of different seam lines that we're going to work on, each one kind of presenting its own different problem for us, and we're going to be solving each one in kind of a little bit different way. So it's a good test subject here for today's video. You only really need some basic tools for removing seam lines. Nippers and knife are always going to come in handy, as well as a part separator, especially if you already have the kit built up like we do in this case. A couple of files might come in handy. In this case, I have a flat file, and one is a half round file for any curved surfaces, which this kit doesn't have, but for any kit that might have a curved surface, especially a recessed curved surface, half round files certainly come in handy for that. And then some sandpaper or sanding sticks. In this case, this is a soft type 600 grit sanding stick here. And then you're going to need some glue, of which there's many options available to you. Tamiya thin cement is going to be probably the most common and most popular. You do also have the quick setting variety of the Tamiya extra thin cement, but we also carry extra thin cement here from SMS, which is going to work in a similar way. And then also for Mr. Hobby, we have the Mr. Cement SP, which is just another option that you can use. Any thin type of cement like this is going to work best for this project. So real quick, what are seam lines and why do we want to remove them? Well, a seam line would be any line like you can see here on the top of the shoulder, where it's essentially a seam or a split between two pieces of plastic that leave a small line there, but the design is not supposed to have a line there. So we want to get rid of that. This is especially useful skill to have if you're planning on painting your GUNPLA, because you want to remove that line and paint this as a solid piece for it to look how it's meant to look. Now, even if you're not planning on painting, removing seam lines can just help the overall look of the kit. Another option would be to turn the seam line into a panel line, like this one here on the arm, for example, because it follows this kind of zigzag pattern there. You could opt to just turn that into a panel line detail rather than closing it up and trying to get rid of it entirely. But the seam lines that we're going to be working on here for today is going to be this one here on the shoulder, and these blue parts here on the side of the shoulder also have a seam line there on those, so we need to get rid of that as well. Here on the forearm, we're going to get rid of this seam line, and these arms on this kit are asymmetrical. So on this left forearm, it's going to present a little bit more of a challenge for us, just because we also have these other parts kind of in the way there. And then we're also going to get rid of this seam line here on the thigh armor pieces as well. So first off, using our part separator, we can start with just some disassembly to give us a better idea of what we're working with. This is why it's also a good idea to hang on to your manuals. Even after you're done with the construction, you can just refer back to the manual just to remind yourself how the parts went together, and that could help you out in deciding how you might want to go about making any changes or modifications, in this case removing the seam lines on this. Now, one of the issues with removing seam lines is that in this case, if we were to simply glue these two parts together and remove that seam line, then once we go to assemble the kit later after painting, we can't get this back on here, and you want to be able to paint this joint part here for the knee in a separate color. One option would be to just leave those parts on there, go ahead and glue that and sand away that seam line. But then the problem is that you're going to have these parts locked together, and you're going to have to mask one of the parts when painting, and you're also going to have a hard time sanding in that small little bit right in there to remove the seam line. So it's just going to be much harder for you if you remove the seam line while this is attached to the knee joint. So we're going to have a much easier time with a little bit of modification. And so essentially these parts here for the thigh are meant to hold this polycap to connect the leg into the hip section and then hold the knee joint in place there. And so we can leave the polycap in and glue those parts together like that. But to be able to slip this back onto the knee joint, we can essentially just cut off these tabs there on the front and the back, and then this will just plug into here directly. So this is where your nippers can come in handy, and I would not recommend using something like very thin God hand nippers or anything, but in this case I'm just using the USA Gundam Store 2.0 nippers, and I've done this many times with these nippers and they're holding up perfectly fine, not going to have any trouble cutting through those bits. So now that we have those removed, and let's pretend that we already have this glued and our seam line is removed there, later after painting we can paint this part separately and paint this part separately, and we can just simply slide that onto place. Now it's not going to stay in place now because we removed those tabs which basically lock it in, but you can just glue that onto there, and it's not at all going to limit your articulation of that. It'll still move as it's meant to. You'll just have to put a little bit of glue on this, so when you slide it into place it will be locked in. So that's the modification. Now, how do we actually go about removing the seam line? Well, the first step for me, I always like to cut any of these little connection pegs down slightly and a little bit at an angle. This is usually a trick that people will use just to help make disassembly a little bit easier. But I'm cutting just the tip of these pegs off at a slight angle. And my reasoning for doing this is just to make sure that when we press these parts together, we want the fit of the seam to be as close as possible. And if those pegs are at all just slightly too long to fit into here, now in this case, it's not going to be an issue, but it's just still a good common practice to have. If those pegs were just slightly too long and preventing this from being pushed together all the way, that would give us a problem. But another good thing to do is to gently sand the surfaces that are going to be glued together. In this case, it's going to be this side here, which I'm just going to color here with a Sharpie just so that's very clear for everybody. And then this side here like that. Those are our surfaces which we want to make sure to lightly sand first. And then the same thing for the opposite piece as well. The problem is that you have those pegs right next to the side, so it might be a little bit difficult to sand that side, in which case we can just focus on lightly sanding this side a little bit just to roughen up the surfaces that are going to be glued together slightly, so that again, once they're glued together, the glue is able to work particularly well. I'll go ahead and try to sand these edges a little bit just to see if I can. And there's two different ways that you could go about applying the glue. You could either apply the glue to our edges here separately and then put it together. But what I like to do is just push these parts, leaving just a tiny little gap. And if we do that, just leaving a small gap in between, when we put the glue in, it'll function as a capillary for the glue to just run along the inside of our line there. So in this case, I'm going to be trying out the quick setting extra thin cement here. And don't be afraid to use a pretty generous amount of this. I usually like to kind of overload it because you're never going to have a problem of having too much glue, because you're going to have to sand the part anyway. So even if you have a little bit too much glue, you can always just sand that away. You don't want to have not enough glue, because then the process isn't going to work as well. So I've loaded that up with a good amount of glue, then just simply press it together as tight as you can, and you can see that bead of glue raised out of the side. That is perfect. What you want to see for that, you want to see a nice amount of glue coming out all along the seam. That means we got a really good connection there for that. So for now, this part is done. We need to give that glue some time to do its thing. This says it's quick setting, so it shouldn't take all that long. I would still, though, give it at least a couple of hours. Typically with the regular thin cement, I like to leave parts overnight and then come back and do my sanding and filing the next day. But we'll give this a couple hours and see how well that quick setting type works. So that was pretty easy. Let's move on to the arms then. We're going to have a similar challenge here for this blue part here on the arms. Once again, I'm going to use my part separator to help pop this piece off. And so you can see these blue parts are connected to a peg here on the gray part, which also has a seam line. So it's kind of like a double layered seam for these parts. So what you could do is remove the seam on these gray parts and get that all done, and then attach these blue parts and then remove the seam on the blue parts. But then again, you're going to have to mask the parts when painting, so you want to keep these blue parts ideally separated from the gray section, so we can remove the seam line on this, have this as a separate piece, paint it separately, and then once we're done with our painting, be able to attach it back onto here. So the easiest way is to leave these pegs in place on the gray part, and then on the inside of there, instead of that just being a circle, we're going to turn that into a small little C-clip by basically cutting out a small section of the inside of that connection peg in here. And so just to mark this again with a marker to show you the small amount of that we're going to be cutting out. Hopefully you can see that. So basically we're going to turn what is a circle there into a C-shaped connection. You want to leave as much as you can of that, but you need to have a section cut out just big enough for the peg to be able to fit in, sliding in from the side. In this case, you can use a combination of knife and nippers, whatever you need. This is a pretty small peg, so I think I can do it just here with a knife. And we just want to cut out a small section of this. Something like that. Once that small section is cut out, then you can kind of test it, basically just to make sure that this peg can fit in from the side here. There we go. Heard it pop into place, and there you go. So you can kind of get the idea of how that's going to work once we have this removed. So essentially on the opposite side, I'm going to cut out a section that's in the same position so that once this is glued together, this part as a whole will just be able to pop into place here like that, basically using a C-clip. Now I've got both sides cut out and I just want to test this out. Always a good idea to test anything before gluing it, especially when you're doing your modification. You always kind of know in theory that it's going to work, but it may not always work out in the way that you think it's going to. So There we go. Nice fit, and it still is functional. And then so I think it's safe to say we can take this off, go ahead and remove that seam line. It'll be good to go. If you find later on after painting that your C-clips were cut maybe a little bit too wide and this is a little bit too loose, again, an option would be that you could just then glue it into place. You won't have this movement here in that case, but that is always an option. So once again, just going to lightly sand here as much as I can the surfaces that are going to be glued on one side and on the other. Slightly trim the peg here ever so much and push that together, leaving just a little gap in between. Apply our glue and press. And there you go, another good connection here for this one, it looks like. We'll set that aside and move on. As the gray parts of the shoulder will actually be probably our easiest. This white vent detail part here on the side is easy, that just pops out. This can just be painted separately and then put back later. And the arm is just connected via a polycap in there. So again, like with the thigh, we can just go ahead and leave the polycap in there, go ahead and lock that into place. The only thing that's going to be locked in the process of removing the seam line would be this part here on the side. Typically, I don't really mind that. I can just leave that in, and then this is an easy part to just paint separately with it being a kind of mostly hidden part inside there. But if you did want to be able to remove this part to be able to paint it separately, you could do it in the same way like we just did for the blue parts. Basically just cut a small section out of that circle to turn it into a C-clip so that this could be inserted in from the bottom into that part there, like so. But do keep in mind, anything that you lock into place is going to be a little bit harder to sand later on. So anything with like this part or this section on the inside of the shoulder armor where this part's going to be kind of getting in the way, you may want to sand ahead of time before you lock it in there, just because you might find it getting in your way later on when you're trying to do the rest of your sanding. In this case, I want to go ahead and just sand a little bit of the inside edge of this, just because that will be better for our painting later on. And also on this one, there's that kind of ugly mold line there on that I kind of just want to get rid of. It's not really going to be all that visible on the finished kit, but it's better to just get rid of it just in case. There we go, we got rid of that nasty mold line in there, and now we can go ahead with removing the seam line here on these gray parts. Once again, gonna ever so slightly cut the pegs on here. You also want to make sure that you have a clean cut on your polycaps, because if you have any little bit of polycap sticking up, that also could get in the way of getting a clean fit between the parts. I don't think that's going to be an issue for this part, but as you can see, I think that's going to be something we're going to have to especially pay attention to here on the forearm. As you can see, that's not even wanting to stay together, and that's just because of that polycap in there. And so after our edges are sanded, we're ready to go ahead and glue this together. Now, if you're wondering about the sanding stick or the sanding grit, I'm using 600 because it's nice and kind of in between. It doesn't really matter if you rough it up too much. So you could use a file, you could use something a bit more rough, then you just have to make sure that you really have enough glue in there to really press it back tight together. You also don't want to use something like, I think like 1200 or anything higher than that. It probably just wouldn't roughen up the surface as much as you need. So once again, we're just going to lightly press this together. So ultimately, I think anything around 400 to 800 grit sandpaper would be good for this purpose. And I would also not recommend using sandpaper, as you're sanding a flat surface and you want it to remain flat. If you use sandpaper, you could round the edges, and if it's rounded, when you go to glue it, it won't be a tight fit between the seams. So definitely use a sanding stick, either a hard type or a soft type sanding stick, but definitely not sanding paper. And as you can see, I almost forgot to put this part back in there. So another thing to just make sure before you glue, always make sure you have everything in place that's meant to be there. And another thing to keep in mind while we're applying our glue is that we have this seam line that goes across the top, but remember that it continues onto the other side of where that white vent was. So don't forget to get the other side. Sometimes the seam line may continue on a part where you're not really thinking of it. You're just focusing on like kind of the main area, and then you forget that there's other parts of the seam that you need to make sure are glued. So after applying an ample amount of glue there, I'm gonna go ahead and press it here, give it a good squeeze for a couple of seconds. You don't need to put like a vice grip on it and leave it overnight. Just once you've squeezed it there like that, and then as I said, you want to see that raised bead of glue along there. That means that the parts are nice and tight together. If glue is pressed out, that means that the plastic is firmly together. And this might be a good idea just to briefly mention about why we use extra thin cement. The great thing about extra thin cement, what it is actually doing is actually melting the plastic. So by using this, when we put our two pieces of plastic together, the glue is not forming a bond between the pieces, it's actually melting the pieces together. So that's why this glue is great for these purposes. And while you wouldn't want to use something like super glue, which is basically going to be a bond between the parts, you don't want to add anything between the parts. You want the parts to be nice and clean together. Now lastly then, let's talk about the forearms. Now they are going to be different, the two forearms, but for this one is going to be the easier one in that we don't have these parts here that we have to deal with. But as I mentioned a moment ago, we are going to have that poly cap. We're going to have to try to see if we can figure out what we need to do to get this to close up cleanly before we go ahead and add the glue to anything. And important to note that while a part separator is great for removing parts, you do want to be a bit careful, especially if it's on a seam line that you want to remove. Because if you put your part separator in here and you turn it really hard, it's going to damage the edges of the plastic that you're planning on removing the seam line from, and that's just going to mean you're probably going to have to fix that with putty. So that's why I'm kind of gently using the part separator to just kind of help separate the parts a little bit, and then trying to just pull them apart gently by hand. And if you're worried about breaking a peg or something, breaking the parts in the process of pulling them apart, you're going to be gluing them back together anyway, so you don't really need to worry too much about that. Typically, parts are held together by 2, 3, or 4 pegs, so if you break one in the process, it's not going to be a great loss. Now, here's going to be the challenge with this part. Just like with the thigh armor, it holds a poly cap, which we can just go ahead and lock into the parts when it's glued together, but it also holds the elbow joint, and the elbow joint is fit around this peg right there in the center. So once again, we're going to have to modify this in order for that to fit. And you could do one of two things. Either you could cut out that peg entirely so that this part will just then fit down into there. But another option would be to leave that peg, which is probably the better idea, and then do like we did for the blue parts on the shoulder, just cut out a section of this part right here. Basically that section there that I've colored in black, cut that out so that this will again basically turn into a C-clip that then when inserted from the top, after we've glued these parts together, it will just clip onto that peg once we put it into place. So for larger sections like this, I'll like to cut out a small bit with nippers first, and then using a knife carefully cut out the rest of what we need to cut out here. That's cut out there like so. Let's go ahead and put these parts back together and test it out. So after these are all glued and painted, we can go ahead and this should just pop into place here. As we're pressing that, we're realizing, it's still not going in. It's because we may have forgot that there's an additional peg here at the back, which is meant to plug into the back of that part right there. This, I would also just opt to just cut off this peg. That is going to be by far the easiest way, and it's not going to damage the stability of the kit or change anything on the outside of the kit at all, so it really doesn't matter at all. But I'm noticing it's still not wanting to push in there, so if we pop this apart, you can see the reason why. This should be fitting onto that peg, but the reason is more so these parts here are kind of getting in the way. So I think we better just cut those back a little bit as well, because those are also ultimately not really going to be all that necessary for us. But now unfortunately, I'm noticing that it's still not fitting in there because there is once again something else that I overlooked. And so rather than redoing this entirely, this is a good opportunity to show you guys just how some things you overlook and it doesn't quite work out exactly how you'd hoped, and you'd have to adapt one way or another. So the problem is this part here at the back is supposed to fit inside of this armor piece in here. It's supposed to be in there like that, and that's what that peg that we just cut off would have maybe been good for. What I could have opted to do was just cut off this section entirely, leave that peg on the back, and then without this front section here, we might have just been able to slip in the joint and plug it into that peg in there like that. That could have worked, but you could still opt to do that and then just glue this without having the peg on the back. Another option would just be to cut a little bit of this part off, the little lip that's basically preventing this from fitting in to here. Alternatively, cut a little bit of this little lip here on the inside of the armor piece. And so you just kind of have to make a decision. Otherwise, another option would be to basically cut a C-clip into this part like we did here onto this inside part so that this part could then fit into there. But I don't really want to do that. I think it's going to be much easier to either just cut a little bit of this off or cut out the inside edges of this. I want to leave the armor piece as it is and opt to just cut this a little bit of that lip off, because ultimately it's going to be hidden on the inside of this armor piece and it's really not going to be visible. So after cutting a little bit of that off, now let's see if it's going to fit. So let's go ahead and test. We're pretending that this is already glued, and this should now fit into place. There we go. So that's in place there. That's going to work out just fine, and no one's going to be the wiser. So the inside of that part is not going to fit quite as it's supposed to, but again, it's the inside part on the back inside of the elbow that is just going to be covered up by this elbow joint anyway. So it all works out, but you guys can see what I mean, how sometimes you're just not really seeing everything right from the start. You could plan it out much better than I did in this case, but sometimes you just have to adapt. Now let's get this polycap back in there, and just looking at this, it looks like maybe the polycap is not cut super clean on the sides. So I just want to trim that just a little bit, just to make sure that it's not getting in the way of us trying to get a good clean fit for our seam line removal. So let's get that then back in place, and hopefully that should have done it. We got to test this to make sure that it's going to be a good solid connection before we put some glue on it. And it looks like, as you can see here, that's still wanting to pop that apart a little bit there at the end, and that's going to be a problem for us. That means it's not going to stay closed when you put the glue in and squeeze it. It's going to pop back open like that, so that's an issue. So after a little bit more trimming, I tried it out and it's finally working, so I'll show that to you here in just a second. But before we do that, I do want to do something about this, because this is not just a straight line. I figure at that angled point there where the line bends, I figure we might as well turn that into a small detail. So actually what I'm going to do, cut out a little bit here with my knife right there, so that when this is glued, this vertical line and this vertical line will be glued together and those will disappear, but basically it will leave a small little hole right there in the armor that will just look like a cool little detail hole. So at long last, we're ready to put some glue on this part, and you can kind of see what I mean about that little cutout section of the armor there. There we go. Some good glue, looks like all the way around that part. So, okay, finally done with that part. And then we can move on to our last one for this video, which is going to be on the seam line on this other forearm, which is going to be a little bit different, presents the same challenge, but slightly different because we have these additional parts on here. So removing the seam line on this side is going to work basically the same, and how we're going to basically separate the elbow joint from the forearm. But what we need to pay special attention to is these parts over here. This little door on the front still needs to be able to open. If you still want that to be able to open, it doesn't necessarily need to, but if you want to preserve that functionality, we need to keep that in mind. And then this part is also stuck in between there. And so once we got this apart, I real quick just cut this piece up just in the same way that we did for the other side. As we saw, there could have been other ways to go about it that maybe would have worked better, but I thought might as well just do it the same way. So cut out the middle section there, cut off the little peg off the back, and then this bit here at the back, cut that down slightly shorter, so that should fit into place. No problem here. But for this bit, that part actually has a seam line of its own there, which we can worry about, but that's actually a pretty simple one. The main thing is we want to be able to put this in later on, and as you can see, it's basically held in by this small square peg and this small circle peg. So I think the easiest way would be to just cut those off, and then later after this is painted, this will just slide into place, and it won't stay there without a little bit of glue, but I'm fine with just gluing it in later. Another option that you may want to consider for something like this would be to adding a magnet in to magnetize it. But once we go ahead and just remove the pegs on both sides, and later once this part is glued together, this part will basically just then fit into here. There we go, like that, and it'll actually be held in place not too bad. So we might not have to glue that anyway, because it's kind of being held in there by the little edge here of those parts. So it's a good thing that we only cut the tab on this side and not that way as well, because those are actually going to help to hold this in place after everything is all painted, and we might not even have to glue that. So that just leaves us with this little door here on the front, and in this case I'm actually not going to modify this, and I'm just going to lock it in place, because sometimes, as much as we would like to have everything separated to be able to paint separately without having to mask anything, Sometimes it's just more trouble than it's worth, and in this case, I think I'm just gonna leave that in, and then ultimately later when it comes time to paint, if I want that to be a separate color, I can just mask it, as it won't be a very difficult part to mask, or just paint it all in the same color, which is another option as well, which I'm perfectly fine with. So for these parts then, we can basically just add our little notch there, make sure the poly cap fits in here nicely, and then it'll be ready to glue. And so once we're ready to go ahead and glue this, just remember that this is gonna be our main one that we're gonna be focused on, but just as a reminder, the seam line is going to continue on to the top part right here, and we want to make sure to not get too much, if any at all, glue if we can in this hinge, so that this part won't end up being glued. If you do, I'll show you how we're going to try to avoid that. Go ahead and apply our glue, and basically just understand that even if we get a little bit of glue in there where we don't want it to be, that it's not a death sentence for that part. It's not going to be instantly glued in place and you can never free it up again. So just remember that we've got a couple of points that we need to make sure we get some glue in here and over here. So we can go ahead and press this here, press the top part good and well there as well. And once we've got that pressed and it's looking like we've got a good connection on that, just to make sure, just in case, if you might have got a little bit of glue in there, just for the first couple of minutes, while the glue is kind of starting to set, just move this piece back and forth a little bit. Make sure that it's still moving fairly freely, and then that should be a good sign that you don't have any glue in there that's gonna set over time and lock it in place there. All right, it's coming back a couple hours later, and I can see here on this forearm piece that we definitely didn't get a good solid connection right here. I've obviously not sanded this down at all yet, but I can tell there's gonna be a little bit of a gap there. In the cases where it's just a little tiny bit like that, instead of using putty, you can just opt for a little bit of super glue. It will just work as a filler for small little holes like that, and it should work fine without having to break out the putty or doing anything like that. So I'm just gonna put a little drop of super glue on there where there's that little gap still remaining there before we go ahead and file this down. All right, so we'll give that a little bit of time to do its thing. In the meantime, our other parts look to be like they're doing pretty good, so let's go ahead and start working on cleaning those up. So all right, everything is all dried up now, and we're good to start our cleanup. Now this is the fun part because it's the pretty easy part here. I like to start off with a file just to make some quick work of this, especially on a part like this, which is just a big, flat, wide open surface. And for that hard to reach bit right in there, this is where that half round file can come in handy because it's got a narrower end on it, so we can file this part here carefully. And then after that, you can see it's already looking pretty smooth, but we need to go over this with a sanding stick now. So just bring back our 600 grit sanding stick to go ahead and go over this, and this should do the trick pretty well. Now, once that's sanded, it does look pretty smooth as far as the seam line goes, but you might notice that it doesn't quite match the finish. We don't have that shiny, glossy finish. So if you're planning on painting, I would recommend sanding all the surfaces just to make sure you get good paint adhesion. But if you're not planning on painting, then obviously you kind of don't really want to leave it like that. So here's where you can go in with a higher grit sandpaper. In this case, I've also got a 1000 grit sanding stick here that we can use to go over this, and this will also help to get it much closer to that smooth finish to match the rest of the part. And there we go. As you can see, it's closer, but still not quite all the way there. So what you could do is bump it up to something even more high, like a 2000 grit sandpaper or something. I also just like to use my shirt or shorts or just a piece of clothing. Also, you could just use just a regular piece of paper too, which acts basically as like kind of something close to like 4,000 or 5,000 grit sandpaper, if you could imagine that. So after just buffing it a bit with my t-shirt, there you go. You can see it got it pretty close to a smooth finish there. So we are going to have some staining from the glue, and you can see we do have those nub marks, but if you can see in the reflection there, it looks like we don't have any line there remaining. So we're good to start painting over that. That said, if you are not planning on painting again, yeah, you will still see that line there. I think the different glue products will maybe have less of that staining to the plastic. So you can experiment with that a bit if you're not planning on painting the kit. But how would you go about cleaning up a part like this? So filing and sanding a flat surface like that is easy enough, but how about like this little detailed part right here that you need to sand around the edge of that? And so pretty much works in the same way. You just have to be really careful with it, because what you can end up doing if you're filing here, the edge of the file will end up damaging the part in a different area there. So you just have to be really careful with it. You can also just stick to just only using a sanding stick, or you can even just use your knife to just sort of actually cut down the glue a bit as if it were basically like a nub mark. Just carefully trimming away the bit of raised glue there before you go in with a sanding stick. Using your knife blade is also a good way to make sure you get the glue in this recessed corner area here too. And then here on this one, you can see here is kind of how that cutout bit ended up looking, but I can see here, and it's gonna be kind of hard to tell because it's very small, but it looks like they're a little bit right towards the end that we didn't get full closure of the seam. There's a couple little spots there. And so that's another important point to mention, that when you're in your process of cleaning up, it's important to check really closely for any imperfections. And then you can just go in and add a little drop of super glue, which is probably what I'll use for just these little kind of dots of remaining seam there. Put the super glue on there, wait for that to dry, file that down. That'll work as a nice little filler there for those little bits. And really important to then also, if you're planning on painting, of course, spray some primer or surfacer on the parts just to test it. And then you may find that you may have missed something and you're gonna have to go back with some super glue or putty and touch it up, because most of the time you hope that it's gonna be perfect at the first attempt, but often it doesn't end up working out that way. So that's about it for this quick GUNPLA tip. It was not very quick and not totally comprehensive, but hopefully that gives you guys some confidence to be able to work on removing seam lines without too much issue. It's a fairly straightforward process, but each seam line can kind of present different difficulties for you. And so I hope that taking a look at a couple of different examples in today's video was helpful, just to give you some ideas as to how you can get creative in removing some seam lines on some different kits. So if you guys have any other further suggestions or tips regarding seam line removal, make sure to leave them in the comments below for anybody else that's wondering. And in the video description, you'll find a link to USA Gundam store where you can find all of our great products, model kits, tools, paints, supplies, all that good stuff there on the website. So check that out, and thank you guys all so much for checking out the video here today. Hope that you did find it useful and informative. We'll see you in the next one. Later, guys.